There's a topic that is hardly talked about. And yet, in our profession, specifically in wealth management, we have to deal with dramatic changes with our clients. And whether that is a big event from retirement or selling a business to the death of a loved one or death of a client. And this is sometimes a very difficult topic to get our heads around and have those conversations. So today we have Dina Bell-Laroche, who's going to talk to us about how we can handle that and how we can have better conversations with our clients on these very, very big life-changing events. Hi, I'm Chris Reynolds, and I'm on a mission to help independent financial advisors build a better business through a remarkable client experience. In this podcast, you're going to learn how to do that from my conversations with the visionaries, the leaders, the independent advisors who are reshaping the future of the financial advice industry. At the end of each episode, you're going to walk away with an actionable idea that you can take and use right now, and it will help you to build a better business today. This is Turning the Page. When we start a business, there's so much to learn. Everything from creating the long-term vision to the day-to-day aspects of how to achieve growth in your business. We got to motivate, we got to manage staff, we got to interact with clients. Our days are full, but there's one thing that is certain, right? We're all human and life happens. A client, a coworker, even a partner could pass away, or some other tragedy can happen that throws the whole plan off and changes our lives and changes the lives of our clients forever. And I've had this happen to me on many occasions. And as we were talking about a little bit before the show, demographically, the pace is speeding up. We're seeing this on a more and more frequent basis. And we might be trained on how to handle the business and financial side of these types of things. But how do we handle the human side? How do we do our professional work while still dealing with our grief and the grief of our clients? And this topic was brought to me by another guest that I had on the podcast. And after reflection, I'm like, yes, this really happens on probably more frequent than we'd like to admit, and it's happening more frequently. And we should, as professionals, learn how to deal with it. So let's do something a little bit different in this podcast, and let's talk about grief in our profession. And we have a great guest speaker to share some insights onto this particular topic, which is Dina Bell-Laroche. She wrote a very special book that, again, was brought to my attention. I've got to go through it, and she has a great story, and I'll let her tell her story, but, it really started with the death of her younger sister, and that was the motivating factor. And from that, she really took this topic and became an advocate for greater grief and loss literacy, because really this is a thing that is shunned generally and something that's sort of put into the back burner. And she really brought it up as both an educator, a professional coach, a keynote speaker. She's written books on it. And I'm going to let her talk a little bit about, her journey and her books. But Grief Unleashed, moving from the whole in our hearts to wholehearted, I think is a must read for anyone in certainly this industry or any industry that has to deal with this on a regular basis. So Dina, welcome to the show. I'm so glad that you're on.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. And it's so interesting when you hear someone who, you just got to meet talk about you and talk about the kind of intimate details of your life in the way that you did. So thank you for setting the table, Chris. I think it's so important that people in your position, people who have credibility and who care about your industry and more generally, just as a human, what you and I were talking about before we stepped on the call, on the podcast, was people that you care about, or maybe not your inner circle, but just really close to that, they're dying. And we, I think, as leaders, as stewards, need to reimagine a more compassionate way of being with life, which includes death.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And your story is so great, like how you came to this sort of journey that you're on. So maybe for the audience, could you share a little bit about your story and how you got here?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. And again, it's kind of like speaking about the unspoken. So in 2001, my younger sister Tracy died. She was a new mom, and so was I. And you know, the cancer that eventually took her, there were 200 people, you know, plus or minus around the world that had the very, very rare form of cancer
Oh,
that she had. So for a long time, and I didn't know how to explain it, but for a long time, I was experiencing, first of all, traumatic bereavement
right.
and then survivor guilt. And I didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't have the language, the literacy, the ABCs and one, two, threes of how to navigate this extraordinarily life altering experience that had me, you know, on the kitchen floor, eat, pray, love style, and really reconsidering everything. And when I shared this, you know, this was 23 years ago, so I've had a moment or two to be able to reflect on the journey I've taken from then to here. And what I would offer is, you know, these moments, when these life shattering moments, these before and afters happen, so to speak, it can really shatter everything that we know and hold to be true. And so, alongside the mourning of my sister, I was also reorienting my whole life. And so, for your listeners, you know, that are in positions often of privilege, right, supporting people as
Right.
financial advisors, you are going to see people, if you have not already, deal with these life altering losses. And what I noticed as a bereaved sister is, first, my grief was disenfranchised, right?
Mm,
Because I was so focused on my brother in law and my parents and other people. I didn't really spend the time needed to be able to grieve my loss as her
right.
sister. And so, having some language to be able to normalize the experience, most of the bereaved, they're not going to need a doctor or therapist to therapize them. What they need is a kind human who will listen to them,
Mm,
who will not offer a platitude like, at least
right.
she's not suffering anymore. At least you have another child. And give people the courage to be able to show up in a conversation so that the person who's bereaved doesn't feel so isolated.
It's noble work. It's something that is very uncommon. I really haven't heard too much about it, and yet it's something that we all live with almost, you know, on a very regular basis. And grief, you know, is something many of us have to deal with personally. You know, what comes someone, whether it's connected in business, it really adds a different dimension. If it's a client or a business associate, um, you know, how is that different from, you know, from family or a close friend? Like, how do you differentiate that? And maybe you can give us some insights into that.
Yeah. So the first thing I'll do is give some literacy. So grief is our internal involuntary response to a loss.
Mm,
So it's internal,
right.
so nobody might see it, and it's involuntary, which explains why if all of a sudden you hear bad news, you might fall to your knees. You don't have the capacity. So that's the first thing.
Right.
So grief is that internal experience. Mourning is when we take our grief and we make it public. And that's where rituals like funerals and gatherings, celebrations of life are so important. So, you know, you were asking about how unusual this grief work is. I would say why I'm galvanized, motivated to do this work, Chris, the people that we might turn to, so therapists and doctors, they often don't have the training.
Right.
It isn't part of the curriculum to teach people how to be human with each other, right? We in our westernized world tend to be death phobic, right? And death denying. So we're denying the fact that at some point we're going to die. And so when we come up with measures like in your world, right, where you're encouraging people maybe to have advanced care directives and
Right.
wills, powers of attorney, does any of that sound familiar?
Absolutely. It's what we do every day.
Right? Get your house in order. If you, the person who's trying to lead them through this, feel ill equipped because you yourself haven't been exposed to death and dying, the reality is in our 21st century, you know, people are dying well past, I would say, their best before date, right? We keep
Right.
people alive using extraordinary measures, and people are living long before they used to,
Right.
right? Because we have all of this technology and other measures. So people now are not used to dying. And they're not dying at home, even though
Right.
the literature will tell you that the vast majority of people who know that they're going to die will choose to die at home instead of hospitals. But the reverse is happening. So people in your industry, I think, can be change agents. And the only way you can do that is if you become more familiar, more adept, more skillful in being able to navigate the waters when someone in front of you is bereaved. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. So maybe if you can give us a few examples, like how to have that discussion, because certainly, as I said, it comes up. My own father passed away several years ago, and so when somebody loses a parent, I can sort of have that conversation because I've been through that experience. But not everybody has had that experience, and as I said, some people feel very uncomfortable addressing those types of things. So maybe give some examples of how to be a better, I guess, person in dealing with that again, especially when it comes to a business side or, as I said, a client or an associate type of thing.
It's such a great question. I would say, let's be better companions. The word companion is really shoulder to shoulder. How can I support you in this time of need? And remember, people aren't going to remember what you said or did. They're going to remember how you made them feel. So let's go
Right.
back to, your father, right? And who passed away. What was his name?
Jesse.
Jesse. Okay. And what did you appreciate most about your dad?
Well, my dad used to have a saying, which is, if I'm hard on you, it means I love you. If I ignore you, it means I don't. So he was a rough guy. Let me, that's the only way that anyone would describe him, is he was a rough cowboy. So, like a real cowboy, like he actually rode bucking broncos when he was a younger man. So that was the best way to
Really?
describe it.
Oh, I love that. I love that story, right? I get a sense of your dad and your eyes are lighting up a little bit and you're remembering this, tough guy who also, was probably a pretty amazing person if he's on a horse, because I'm a horse person. So that
Ah,
already
there you
I'm
go.
thinking fondly of your dad. Okay, so your father passed and like what do you miss most about him?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it was, as father figures do, he was just there. You knew that he was always there. He was that sort of logical rock that when everyone else is sort of giving you platitudes, he wouldn't. He'd pretty much tell you how it is. So, and it
Mm,
wasn't usually the answer you wanted, but it was probably
yeah.
the right one.
Oh, it's not the answer I wanted, but maybe it was the answer I needed.
Right.
Mm. Thanks for sharing your story. So, you know what we did just there? That's what we need to teach people how to do. And the only way we can do that, I don't know if your listeners know, but I've toiled, I played in the world of elite sport for the last 34 years of my career, right?
Oh,
So,
we didn't. Let's share that.
yeah, so 5 Olympic Games. I was part of, the team, not as an athlete, but as a support staff and also a media attaché and then press chief. So I know and understand the world of sport, elite sport. I know what it takes to like grind and be at your best and represent Canada on the world stage. And I've accompanied athletes and coaches who are grieving their loss, these forgotten grievers, right? Who carry loss after loss after loss. And what can happen, Chris, is when we stack loss after loss after loss without expressing it, without giving it some room to breathe, it turns into anxiety, it turns into potential trauma, right? And then we see that people are at risk of burnout and compassion fatigue, right? Vicarious trauma. So the work that we do to normalize, socialize people is so important. And in your world, it makes me think of your people as coaches, right? They're
Right.
financial coaches. I
Yeah.
work with sport coaches. I'm a professional coach myself. And financial coaches need to feel like they are grounded regardless of the person who's going to show up, because their job, number one job, is to support them, right? In their financial acumen. A lot of your people, I imagine, come into money after the death of someone they loved. So can you imagine for a moment I call it bittersweetness of that? The
Mm.
sweetness of being able to maybe do something on behalf of my father, who passed last year, but then the bitterness and maybe some of the guilt that I might be experiencing because the only reason I can do this is because my father has died. Can you feel that?
Yeah, actually, I never even thought of it in those terms, but very much so. That as you said, I've inherited money. I've got it from somebody who passed. It's great to have money, but I had it. What would I have given up not to have that occur? And I can see that as a
Yeah.
struggle for some people, for very much so.
Exactly. So, some of the work I'm doing now is working with physicians around equipping their own sense of comfort with being able to have the conversation around death and dying. And that might blow your mind, right? Like, really?
Yeah.
Physicians don't already know this? No, because they don't teach it in schools. We teach physicians how to cut us open and how to repair broken hearts. but we don't actually teach them some of the social skills required to be able to bear witness to someone who's in pain. And if we can do that as caring humans, right, as
Right.
companions, that loyalty that you're going to bake into that relationship with your client, that's going to retain them. And of course, as a business girl, you want to retain the clients you've worked so hard to have, right?
Absolutely.
I would also imagine, so take it to a next level. And I see this with athletes, right? They're loyal to their coach. All of a sudden, their coach leaves and a new coach comes in. They're like, you're not the coach of me. You haven't earned my trust. And I suspect that the same might be true for a financial advisor who buys a new book of business, right? Or
Right.
is inheriting one, or, right? Can you
Right.
feel the
Yep. Yeah. You have to reestablish the whole relationship, including the trust.
Exactly. So how do you do that in a way that builds trust and allows the person who's bereaved, maybe they've known their financial advisor for 25 years. So how do we do that? We do that by honoring the person, right? The bridge. That person is now a bridge from them to you, from a new client to you. And and if I'm a client and I feel safe and I feel welcomed and you're honoring the person that has connected us, now all of a sudden I'm like, oh, okay. So some examples that we can learn from are, maybe there's a memorial plaque. Maybe there's a little plaque in your
Right.
built office that says, we're remembering Jack, the financial advisor, right?
Yeah.
Maybe there's a little ribbon, or there's something. I have grieving pins that I give people, right?
Mm.
So there's ways we can honor, and this is where the importance of ritual comes in. But if we don't have the basic fundamental literacy, in my world, I talk about authenticity, right? Because people will feel it in their bodies, whether or not you're just like trying to bottom
Go
line
through it,
something,
or actually, yeah, authentic. Right.
or if you care. So
Right.
how do you know? You're going to feel it in your body before your head. And I would offer that these rituals that are traditions, right, that have passed down over the ages, can be incredibly healing. So as a financial advisor, you can only take people in a difficult conversation around death and loss if you yourself are comfortable with the topic. Otherwise, it's going to come across as like,
Yeah. Try to avoid it, trying to get out of it, trying to do the minimum amount that you can to get away with it.
yeah, exactly. So, for what I would advise, and it's what I advise sport coaches who are trying to help athletes process a life altering loss or work through a transition like an illness or an injury, which means that they're no longer making the team. Because loss is everywhere, right? It's both death related losses, and your financial advisors would traverse this path as well, what we call living losses.
Right.
So a scenario there is, imagine you're a financial advisor to a married couple and then they get divorced.
Right.
Has that
Yeah.
ever
That's a
happened
good
before?
point. It probably happens quite a bit.
Right.
60% of the time, according to stats, but
Exactly. So now, divided loyalties. Are you still going to maintain a relationship with both people? What does that look like moving forward? How do you normalize this? How do you even grieve your own attachment to these two people? And you have to choose. It's kind of like a Sophie's choice now. I don't want to choose. So do I walk away? And ethical practice, right? I need to be able to name all of this. So living losses, the ending of relationships, right? Territories moving away,
right.
all of these things that we don't talk about. So, what I advise people is do your own work, right? I have a little practice in my book where I help people understand the accumulation of their life losses.
Hmm.
So, just even like a little quadrant where you divide your age by 4 and start to acknowledge, wow, I never thought I'd been through a death. But now that Dina and Chris are talking about life losses, likely your parents have been divorced,
Right.
likely you've moved homes, likely you've lost, a dog or a cat or a pet, goldfish, likely a grandparent has died, likely you had your heart broken. These are all losses.
Hmm.
And when we can look at our own life losses, then our ability to be more present, empathetic, authentic in front of someone else, then it becomes available to us. But you can't fake this stuff. You got
No,
you got to be real. Does that make sense?
absolutely. You got to be real. And I think your point is about grief. Grief isn't just about death per se. Like we see it in our business all the time because a dramatic change in somebody, can grieve. Retirement is tough on people. We see it all the time where people hold on and hold on and hold on. They retire. We know this especially around business owners, both internally and externally, where they identify themselves as their business. Like that is their identity. And it's very, very difficult for them to let go of that identity because their whole life is caught up in being a business owner or being, the person that people look to when they think of that business. And that, I guess, is a form of grief. Would you agree?
Oh, 100%. And in fact, I think we do ourselves a disservice by calling it retirement. We retire horses to pasture. There's a connection with your dad, Jesse,
Yeah,
right?
there you go.
So we take these horses, we put them out in the pasture. But what about renewalment? Like, really, what we're saying is this chapter of my life is closed and it's been a big part of who I am. If I don't prepare for what comes next, and this is what I do, the work with retired athletes, that's a lot of what we do. Who am I now? But we can't really fully meet the future moment of who I am now if I don't pause and grieve the who I was. Because I loved the excitement and my teammates and my coach and traveling the world and a sense of belonging when I wore the maple leaf, right? That was who I was. And I can
Right.
still carry those parts with me. A financial advisor who understands that will ask different questions to their client, right? As they prepare for so-called retirement. It's like, well, beyond your financial goals, what are some of the hopes and dreams that you have as you step
Right.
away from, this known way of being towards something else? Can you imagine that conversation?
Yeah, and those are the conversations. To your point, that's really what we're about. As a financial advisor, as much as people look at from investing and products and whatever, really it is understanding people. It's really understanding and empathizing with their situation, and hopefully providing enough guidance and help that they can improve that situation and they can move forward. And this is, as I said, a great topic because we know it happens literally to everybody in some form at some time in their life.
Exactly. And so, the way that I see your financial advisors, because I have one, they are, first of all, they're in a position of privilege and a position of power because they
Right.
have access to details that most people don't, right? My financial health. And if I treat that relationship, if I'm a financial advisor and I treat that relationship with humility and grace and compassion and skill and knowledge, I'm not just the doctor without the bedside manner.
Right.
I'm someone who actually feels grateful that you've chosen me as your financial advisor, and I'm here for you when life is flourishing and when life goes sideways. That's a game changer,
That
I
it
think, right?
that is a game changer. Now I have to know, what was the sport? I didn't know that you were in the Olympics and were part of the Olympics for that long. Was it equestrian or was it
Not
something
an
else?
no, not as an athlete. Although my first job ever, my real job, not my Susie Shear job that I had when I was 15, but when I graduated in journalism, that was my first degree. And then I started working for the Canadian Equestrian Federation. So I got to meet Big Ben and Ian McMillan,
Yes, I would
right?
know who that is, but not
Right.
everyone,
But
but
no,
I do.
I was a media attaché.
Oh, that's
So
fantastic.
I was the interface between, the Canadian team and the media. And so I served in Canadian
Ah,
sport for, almost 15 years. And now I own my own sport consulting business, right, with my business partner. And
right.
we provide all kinds of services, management services, leadership services, legal services to the Canadian sport organizations. But this work that I'm sharing with you, it's like my soul work. This is the gift that my sister continues to, shine through me in many special ways. And talking to you today and talking about learning more about your dad is one of the things that I love doing.
Well, I'm certainly glad that you are doing it and continuing to be inspired by your sister. So now I do a certain segment of my podcast where it's called Rapid Fire, which we don't send in advance, so that you have to just answer the question.
Ooh, I
So I'm going to
love
answer
this.
you
Bring it
three.
on.
I'm going to ask three questions, and
Okay.
it's whatever the first thing that pops in your mind. And I'm sure I'm actually going to guess. I probably know the answer to all three,
Okay.
but I'm going to go through them. So the first question I was asked is, what are you passionate about? What are you truly passionate about?
Healthy humans.
That makes perfect sense. And now, what is your most memorable experience?
Mm, the birth of my children and
Hmm?
watching my sister die.
Yes, that I can imagine that would be something that you would never forget, no matter how long time goes by. That would be something that would always be on your mind.
Yeah, can I just offer something,
Yes,
Chris? You are the most present at the birth of a human and the ones that take their last breath.
uh, that's pretty insightful. My last question is: how would you like to be remembered?
Well, fun fact, in my book, I wrote the obituary.
Oh, well, that's how you'd like to be, which is a great exercise. I've had business coaches, recommend the same
Yeah.
thing. But
Yeah, begin with the end in mind. I
yes,
hope people remind me as being kind and committed and courageous and compassionate.
and I think they will.
Oh,
So
thanks,
this has been
Chris.
a great been a great show. I'm glad that you've been on it and been a part of it. And for our audience, this is something to really think about. This is something that happens, as I said, on a very regular basis within our practices, within our personal lives,
Mm.
and it's not something that we can just sort of hide from. It's a reality, and it's something that needs to be addressed. And hopefully, there's a few tips today that they can help you with that and those difficult conversations. So, Dina, thank you so much for being on. Anything to add, and maybe talk a little bit about your book before we let you go?
Yeah, well, thank you for that opportunity. The last chapter of my book talks about companioning the bereaved. So I kind of give people some more muscles because I am a coach, right? So
Yeah.
I help them build those authentic muscles around being able to be in the conversation. And I would say, my book, you can find it. Just go to griefunleashed.ca. It's the title of my book. I guess I'm not that creative. I just thought
Well,
I'd make it
it's pretty
easy
easy
for
to
people.
find then. Yeah.
I would say the one, two, threes, if we bottom line it, show up,
Yep.
shut up, just listen,
Yep.
right? And show up and shut up, right?
Yeah.
Maybe
I
just two.
I'm pretty sure that all of us could take that in probably every aspect of life.
Actually, think you're welcome for the marriage advice, right?
Yeah, exactly. I know that well. So, Dina Bell-Laroche, thank you so much for being on Turning the Page.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining me on Turning the Page. What did you learn from today's episode? If you follow me on LinkedIn, please drop me a comment there. I'd love to chat with you about it over a virtual coffee. Send me a message on LinkedIn, or you can do so at our website. The link's in the show notes. I'm Chris Reynolds, and until next time.